Why did Americans call hamburgers Liberty sandwiches during World War I? It's a story about war, fear, patriotism, and how quickly public feelings can turn. It shows how even everyday things like food can get caught up in big global events. This renaming wasn't just a random choice, it came from deep-seated worries and a powerful push to unite the country against a common enemy. To really get why hamburger became a Liberty sandwich, you have to go back a bit, before the war even started. The hamburger, as we know it, has roots in Germany, specifically Hamburg, a big port city. The sailors coming from Hamburg would bring their culinary traditions with them. One of these was a kind of minced or ground meat, often served raw or lightly cooked, sometimes seasoned, called Hamburg steak. It was common in their home country. When these sailors came to America, they brought these food customs along. Immigrants often bring their food with them. That is just how culture works. As German immigrants came to America in the 19th century, in big numbers, they brought many parts of their life. Their language, their customs, their music, and their food all started to blend into American life. Places like Milwaukee, Cincinnati, St. Louis, and parts of Pennsylvania saw large German communities grow. They built breweries, bakeries, and butcher shops. They opened restaurants. In these places, Hamburg steak was a familiar item. It was a taste of home. Over time, this Hamburg steak changed. Someone, somewhere, probably put it between two slices of bread or a bun. This made it easier to eat, especially for people working or moving around. And just like that, the hamburger was born, or at least its direct ancestor. Its name always carried that German link. Before World War I, this German connection was mostly seen as a good thing, or at least neutral. The German culture had a big influence on America. Think about Christmas trees, kindergarten, even public education itself in some ways. The German breweries made popular beer. German music, like classical compositions, was widely appreciated. German-American communities were thriving and integrated. They were a significant part of the American fabric. They contributed greatly to the economy, to local politics, and to the cultural landscape. Many German Americans had been in the country for generations. They saw themselves as fully American, even if they held onto some of their ancestral customs and language. They often spoke German at home and in their communities, went to German language churches, and read German language newspapers. This was normal. It was part of America's immigrant story. But even before the war, there were small undercurrents of distrust. Sometimes, new immigrant groups faced suspicion from older, more established groups. There were people who worried about the sheer number of German immigrants. They worried about their loyalty. This wasn't unique to Germans, Irish, and Italian immigrants also faced similar questions at different times. But with Germans, the concern sometimes linked to events happening in Europe. Germany was a rising power. It was building a strong military. It was getting involved in international politics in a more aggressive way. So there were whispers sometimes. People might wonder if German Americans would truly side with America if there was ever a conflict with Germany. These whispers were usually quiet, not mainstream. They were background noise. When World War I started in Europe in 1914, America tried to stay neutral. President Woodrow Wilson wanted to keep the country out of the bloody conflict. This was hard to do. Many Americans had ties to one side or the other. Irish Americans often sided with Germany because they disliked Britain. Italian Americans had loyalties to Italy, and of course, German Americans largely felt a connection to their ancestral homeland. This put them in a difficult position. They were American citizens, but their heritage was German. Many still had family there. They cared about what was happening in Germany. As the war raged in Europe, public opinion in America slowly started to shift. News reports, though often biased, began to paint Germany in a bad light. German military actions, like the invasion of Belgium, were portrayed as brutal. The sinking of the Lusitania in 1915, a British passenger ship with many American lives lost due to a German submarine attack, really turned many against Germany. This event was a turning point for many Americans. It felt like a direct attack, even though America was neutral. The idea that Germany was a ruthless, militaristic nation started to take hold. Propaganda, even before America entered the war, began to work its way into public thought. It primed people for a more hostile view of anything German. German Americans, for their part, often tried to defend Germany's actions or express understanding for their reasons. This was natural, given their heritage, but in an increasingly anti-German climate, these actions were seen by some as disloyal. It created a divide. People started to question if German Americans were truly 100% American. This was the seed of the widespread anti-German sentiment that would fully bloom once America officially entered the war. The stage was set. The hamburger, with its very German name, was sitting right there waiting to become a symbol. Its simple, everyday presence in American life made it an easy target for those who wanted to purify American culture of anything that seemed foreign or, worse, enemy. The food item itself was innocent. Its name, however, carried the weight of a nation now seen as an enemy. The transformation from a beloved food to a symbol of disloyalty, or at least a name needing to be cleansed, was already in motion before the first American soldiers stepped onto European soil. This simmering distrust and the easy association of food names with national identity would become a powerful force, affecting everything from school curricula to the names of common dishes. When America finally declared war on Germany in April 1917, everything changed fast. Neutrality was over. Now Germany was not just a warring nation across the ocean. It was an enemy. And this shift in status meant that anything associated with Germany, no matter how small or innocent, became suspect. This is when the quiet whispers of distrust against German Americans turned into a loud, angry roar. Patriotism became a fierce, all-consuming force. It was pushed hard by the government. It was echoed in newspapers and across communities. The government played a huge part in this. President Wilson created the Committee on Public Information, CPI. George Creel, a journalist, led it. The CPI was basically a massive propaganda machine. Its job was to build public support for the war. It needed to unite a diverse country. It needed to make people believe that joining the war was the right thing to do. And part of that job was to paint Germany as the ultimate evil. The CPI used posters, pamphlets, films, and speeches to spread its message. They called Germans Huns and Beasts. They said Germany was a threat to democracy and liberty everywhere. This kind of language was incredibly effective. It worked on people's emotions. It made them feel angry and scared. With this kind of intense propaganda, it became easy to see German Americans as a potential fifth column. That term means a group of traitors hiding within a country ready to help the enemy. The government encouraged people to report suspicious activity. Loyalty became everything. If you were German American, you had to prove your loyalty, and proving it often meant rejecting anything German. It meant changing your name. It meant not speaking German. It meant buying war bonds and publicly supporting the American war effort. If you didn't do these things, you risked being targeted. This created a climate of fear. People were scared of German spies. They were scared of sabotage. This fear turned into real harassment and violence against German Americans. German-language newspapers were shut down or censored. German books were removed from libraries. German music was banned from concert halls. There were public burnings of German books. German was even removed from school curricula in many places. It was an effort to erase German culture from American life, at least temporarily. The scale of this anti-German hysteria is hard to fully grasp today. Over 2 million German-born people lived in America at the time, and millions more were of German descent. They were suddenly put in an impossible situation. They were told to abandon their heritage or face severe consequences. Their neighbors, who had lived alongside them peacefully for years, now looked at them with suspicion. In some extreme cases, German Americans were physically attacked. Some were tarred and feathered. One famous case was Robert Prager, a German immigrant who was lynched in Illinois in 1918. He was accused of being disloyal. No one was ever convicted for his murder. This tragic event showed how far the anti-German sentiment could go. Beyond the violence, there were many smaller but still significant acts of cultural cleansing. In towns with German names changed them. For example, Berlin, Iowa became Lincoln, Iowa. German shepherds were sometimes called Alsatian wolfhounds. Even Dachshunds were sometimes called Liberty Pups. It was a widespread effort to scrub anything German from the public eye and ear. This wasn't just official policy, it was also a groundswell of public emotion. People felt it was their patriotic duty to reject anything German, to embrace 100% Americanism. This intense pressure meant that German Americans often felt they had no choice but to assimilate completely and visibly. They changed their last names. Schmidt became Smith, Muller became Miller. They stopped speaking German, even at home. They tried to be more American than anyone else just to avoid suspicion. It was a painful time for many families. They had to shed a big part of who they were because of a war on the other side of the world. So when we talk about changing hamburger to Liberty sandwich, it wasn't just about a food item. It was part of this much bigger, very intense movement. It was about defining what it meant to be American during wartime. It was about removing any trace of the enemy, even from common language. The word German itself became taboo. If a food item had German in its name, or was simply known to come from Germany, it had to go. It was a matter of national unity and wartime morale. The logic was simple. Even if it was extreme, anything that reminded people of Germany could be seen as weakening the war effort. This was the environment in which everyday objects like food got caught in the crosshairs of patriotism and propaganda. The innocent origin of a popular food item was suddenly a liability. The stage was truly set for its transformation. The push to rename German foods wasn't just about patriotism, it was also deeply connected to the war effort on the home front, especially food. Food became a weapon in World War I. It was a strategic resource, and how Americans ate their food directly impacted the war. The government understood this. They knew that a united effort at home, including how people managed their pantries, could help win the war. President Wilson appointed Herbert Hoover to head the U.S. Food Administration. Hoover's job was big conserve food, produce more food, and make sure that American food supplies could feed not only American soldiers, but also Allied armies and civilians in Europe. These countries, especially France and Britain, were struggling. Their farms were disrupted. Their supply lines were under attack. America had to step up. Hoover's motto became famous: food will win the war. This wasn't a call for rationing by government mandate, at least not initially. Instead, Hoover launched a massive campaign to encourage voluntary conservation. He wanted people to eat less of certain foods so more could be sent overseas. This was known as Hooverizing. It relied on patriotism and community spirit. People were urged to sign pledges, promising to follow the Food Administration's guidelines. These guidelines included meatless Mondays. People were encouraged to grow victory gardens in their backyards, parks, and even on vacant lots. These gardens helped supplement household food and freed up commercial supplies for the war effort. The Food Administration used propaganda just like the CPI did. Posters showed Uncle Sam urging people to serve just enough, or waste nothing. Recipes were published showing how to cook with less meat, sugar, and wheat. Schools taught children about food conservation. The women's clubs organized cooking demonstrations. It was a nationwide effort to change eating habits. Food waste was seen as unpatriotic. Saving food was a direct contribution to winning the war. This focus on food had a direct impact on the renaming of German-associated foods. The name hamburger was linked to Germany. In a time when German submarines were sinking ships carrying food to Europe, and German forces were fighting against American soldiers, anything German felt wrong. Well, it felt out of place. It felt like it contradicted the very spirit of the homefront sacrifice. Why would Americans, who were being asked to give up so much, continue to use German names for their food? It just didn't fit the narrative of a total war effort. So the renaming of food items was a logical extension of the anti-German sentiment and the food conservation movement. It was a way to make the home front even more American. It was a way to remove any lingering reminders of the enemy from daily life, even something as simple as a meal. The thinking was, if we're fighting Germany, we shouldn't be celebrating anything German, even unintentionally, by using their words. It wasn't about the food itself being harmful, it was about the name. The government didn't issue an official decree banning the word hamburger. It was more of a grassroots movement fueled by government propaganda and public sentiment. Local restaurants, butchers, and grocery stores started changing their signs. They understood the public mood. They knew it was good for business to show their patriotism, and they knew it would be bad for business to appear unpatriotic. If a restaurant continued to sell hamburgers, it might face backlash from its customers. People might see it as being sympathetic to the enemy. This was a risk no business wanted to take during such a sensitive time. Many German origin food names suffered a similar fate. Sauerkraut, for instance, became Liberty cabbage. Frankfurters, another German named sausage, sometimes became Liberty sausages, or just hot dogs. Even German fried potatoes became American fried potatoes. It was a cleansing of the menu, a way to ensure that every bite taken at home was a patriotic one. The connection between food, national identity, and wartime sacrifice became incredibly strong. Eating a Liberty sandwich wasn't just eating lunch. It was a small act of defiance against the enemy. It was a small way to show loyalty. It reinforced the idea that America was united, even in its culinary choices. The Food Administration's efforts went beyond just renaming. They promoted alternative ingredients to save wheat and sugar. Recipes used cornmeal, rye flour, and oats instead of wheat. Honey and molasses replaced sugar. These changes weren't always popular, but people adopted them out of a sense of duty. They saw it as their part in the war. The renaming of hamburger to Liberty sandwich was just one visible part of this much larger transformation of the American home front during WWI. It showed how deeply the war affected everyday life, down to the food on people's plates and the words they used to describe it. This was a time when language itself was seen as a battlefield, and the humble hamburger was a casualty of that linguistic war. The renaming of hamburger to Liberty Sandwich was not an isolated event. It was part of a much larger trend during World War I to expunge German associations from American culture and language. This trend covered many different things, from food to dog breeds to town names, as already mentioned. The word liberty became the go-to substitute. It carried immense symbolic power. Liberty stood for everything America claimed to be fighting for: freedom, democracy, and self-determination against what was seen as German authoritarianism. So when restaurants and butcher shops started changing their menus, Liberty Sandwich was a natural fit. It directly countered the German origin of hamburger with a word that represented American ideals. It was a simple, clear message. You weren't eating something from the enemy's land. You were eating something patriotic, something that celebrated American values. This made people feel better. It made them feel like they were part of the solution, even when just ordering food. Consider the other food names that changed. Sauerkraut is a German word meaning sour cabbage. It became Liberty Cabbage. This change was widespread. Many restaurants and grocery stores adopted it. It sounded American, it felt American, it wiped away the German heritage. Frankfurters, a type of sausage named after Frankfurt, Germany, sometimes became Liberty sausages. Even pretzels, which have a strong German heritage, were occasionally rebranded or just avoided by some. The idea was to remove anything that reminded people of Germany. This phenomenon was driven by a combination of public sentiment, government encouragement, though not direct mandates for food names, and businesses wanting to align themselves with patriotic fervor. If a local restaurant kept sauerkraut on its menu, it risked alienating customers. But if it proudly advertised Liberty Cabbage, it showed its loyalty. It was a smart business move in a charged atmosphere. The public's reaction was generally positive, at least among the non-German American population. People embraced these new names. It felt like they were doing their part. It was a tangible, everyday way to show solidarity with the war effort. It was a way to feel good about what they were eating. For German Americans, however, it was often another painful reminder of their marginalized status. It was one more piece of their heritage being taken away or scorned. They might have quietly continued to use the old names among themselves, but in public they likely conformed. The media played a significant role in promoting these new names. Newspapers and magazines, already heavily influenced by CPI propaganda, would often use the Liberty names in their recipes and food sections. They helped normalize these changes. They made it seem like the natural, patriotic thing to do. If a recipe called for Liberty Cabbage, it reinforced the idea that this was the correct and accepted term. This constant reinforcement helped solidify the new names in the public consciousness, even if only for a short time. The power of language during wartime cannot be overstated. Words become more than just sounds or symbols. They become loaded with meaning. They can be used to unite, to divide, to inspire, and to demonize. In WWI America, language was actively used to shape national identity. It was used to draw clear lines between us and them. Changing hamburger to Liberty Sandwich was a perfect example of this. It was a small linguistic battle, but it reflected a much larger cultural war. It was about creating a purely American identity that was free of any perceived enemy influence. It also showed how easily fear and nationalism can override logic and historical fact. The hamburger, in its American form, had become a distinct American food. Its German origins were distant for most people. But during the war, those origins suddenly mattered a lot. They were seen as a threat. The renaming was a symbolic act, a way of purifying the American plate. It was less about the actual food and more about the name's association. These name changes weren't always officially mandated. They were often spontaneous and organic, arising from the public mood. But they were certainly encouraged by the general climate of intense patriotism and anti-German sentiment that the government fostered. This was a time when being 100% American was paramount, and for many that meant stripping away any German connections, no matter how remote or benign. The Liberty Sandwich became a small, delicious symbol of this fierce commitment. It showed how deeply the war affected not just battlefields and politics, but the very fabric of daily life and the language people use to describe it. This chapter illustrates the specific, tangible ways that anti-German hysteria manifested in everyday cultural practices, making the point that war impacts everyone, everywhere, in unexpected ways. World War I ended in November 1918. With the war over, the intense anti-German sentiment slowly began to fade. The immediate threat was gone. The need for such extreme patriotic displays lessened. And so many of the Liberty names started to disappear. Liberty cabbage went back to being sauerkraut. Liberty sandwiches reverted to hamburgers. This happened fairly quickly, often within a few months or a year after the armistice. People were tired of the war and they were ready for things to go back to normal. That included their food names. However, the period of intense anti-German feeling left a lasting mark. The damage done to German American communities was significant. Many people had changed their names, not just for the war, but permanently. Many German language institutions, like newspapers and schools, never fully recovered. The use of the German language in America declined sharply and never really bounced back to its pre-war levels. A distinct part of American culture, once vibrant and openly celebrated, was forced underground or simply disappeared. The memory of this time remained too. It served as a stark reminder of how quickly public opinion can turn against an immigrant group during a time of national crisis. It showed how easily fear and propaganda can lead to the marginalization and persecution of an entire community, even those who were loyal citizens. It was a lesson in the fragility of cultural acceptance. The Liberty Sandwich story, while seemingly small, is a perfect example of this broader historical lesson. It highlights how powerful symbols are, even simple words. It shows how language can be manipulated to serve political and wartime agendas. It also demonstrates the pressure on individuals and communities to conform during times of national stress. Yes, people wanted to belong, they wanted to prove their loyalty, and sometimes changing the name of a sandwich was one way to do that. And this phenomenon wasn't unique to World War I. Later, during World War II, when America fought Japan, there was a similar push against anything Japanese. Japanese Americans, even those born in the U.S., were interned in camps. Their loyalty was questioned simply because of their ancestry. The WWI experience with German Americans set a precedent for how the U.S. might treat groups associated with enemy nations in future conflicts. It showed a pattern. In a broader sense, the Liberty Sandwich period reflects on American identity itself. America is a nation of immigrants. Its strength comes from its diversity. But during wartime, there's often a push for a more homogeneous, poor American identity. This often comes at the expense of minority groups or those with ties to enemy nations. It's a tension that has always existed in the American story, the balance between celebrating diversity and demanding national unity. The hamburger, despite its temporary name change, emerged from the war even more popular. It had become a staple of American cuisine. Its German roots were largely forgotten by the general public. It just became the hamburger, an iconic American food. The temporary renaming to Liberty Sandwich became a curious footnote in its history, a reminder of a strange, intense period. So, while the name Liberty Sandwich itself faded, the lessons from its creation and disappearance endure. It teaches us about the power of propaganda, the dangers of xenophobia, and the complex relationship between food, language, and national identity during times of war. It's a reminder that even the simplest things in our daily lives can become symbols of much larger conflicts and societal shifts. It shows how war reaches into every corner of life, changing not just borders and governments, but also the names we give to our food and the way we see our neighbors. It's a piece of history that helps us understand the often uncomfortable, sometimes dark, side of patriotism and national unity. It's a story that asks us to think about how we define American and how we treat those who might seem other during times of crisis. And ultimately, it's a story about a country trying to find its way in a complex world, sometimes making choices that, in hindsight, seem extreme, but at the time felt absolutely necessary. The burger survived, but the memory of its wartime identity remains a poignant historical detail. It makes you think about how we react today when global events challenge our sense of stability. Do we still look for enemies in everyday places? Do we still rename things to fit a narrative? Maybe not in such an obvious way, but the underlying mechanisms of fear, unity, and identity are still very much at play in how we talk about ourselves and others. The Liberty Sandwich is a small window into a very big historical truth about how societies respond to pressure. And that's why this small detail about a sandwich name matters. It isn't just a quirky fact. It's a tangible link to a turbulent time, showing the depth of feeling and the extent of the cultural upheaval that World War I caused on the American home front. It reveals how even the most mundane parts of life can become battlegrounds for national identity and wartime fervor. The name change was more than symbolic. It was an active participation in the psychological warfare waged at home, intended to reshape perceptions and reinforce loyalty. It was a time when language itself was nationalized and everyday objects were enlisted in the fight.